I've talked a bit here recently about the Carl Froch situation and who he'll fight next. Namely, that I viewed him having three options in terms. I don't see the Golovkin fight as realistic, so I think Carl Froch's three options are the George Groves rematch, the Andre Ward rematch, and the Mikhail Kessler rubber match. The one that Carl Froch seems to be pushing for more and more is the Andre Ward fight. It seems that he's desperate to avenge the only loss in his record. It's a fight that, whilst boxing purists will probably be interested in, the public are possibly struggling to get excited about. I think the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, the momentum behind George Groves at present means the public are desperate to see that one happen again. Secondly, the public have really struggled to buy into Andre Ward. He's not a massive knockout puncher. He's not a very charismatic figure. He's someone who doesn't bring too much of a fan base. And I think because of that, and with the demand for the George Groves fight in Britain, I think the potential for a sort of summer stadium showdown is such that is probably the most financially viable option. There is also the concern that at 36, Carl Froch has tasted enough of George Groves and would rather, move in opposite directions. Obviously, Groves was a mandatory. He's took Groves, whatever the controversy, he's defeated Groves by stoppage, and perhaps he's slightly less keen to go in against a young lion of George Groves's potential again so quickly. Andre Ward would certainly seem to be less of a threat in terms of knocking Froch out, I guess, which is something that he understandably would like to avoid. My instincts at the minute is that the Groves fight is going to have to happen purely because of the financial viability. And whilst Froch may want to go about getting a Ward fight on, Ward's not going to come to the UK. Froch isn't going to go to the US, and I think that the demand for Groves Froch has a real sort of legacy damaging potential if it doesn't occur. I think Carl Froch is all about legacy. He loves his record. He loves talking about who he's been in against and his reputation as a warrior. And I think that if he declines to a Groves rematch, despite all the demand and the money that's definitely going to be there, it's going to do much more damage to his legacy, so we say. However, having said all of that, a new challenge has this week occurred to Froch, and certainly another credible opponent in terms of who Froch could go in against next, which is Adonis Stevenson. Adonis Stevenson is the WBC version of the light heavyweight champion. He was actually the mandatory for Carl Froch at the IBF, for Froch's IBF strap at super middleweight. Froch decided instead to go down the Mikhail Kessler rematch route, and Adonis promptly moved up to light heavyweight to get it on with Chad Dawson. Now, Adonis Stevenson clearly is someone who Eddie Hearn is going to know very well. Eddie Hearn also promotes Tony Bellew, who was stopped in the 6th round of their fight this weekend. I've done a post-fight analysis video on that one, so please check that out. And Adonis Stevenson, after the fight, was very quick to call out Carl Froch. Despite coming into the ring at 190 pounds, which is, give or take 13.5 stone, bit more than that, Stevenson is confident he can still make the super middleweight weight limit of 12 stone, and said that he would be happy to drop down for Carl Froch. Now, I think it's unlikely Froch would move up to light heavyweight because of how comfortable he is at the weight. But a showdown with Stevenson is certainly possible due to the money. I think it would be a pay-per-view fight in England, certainly, and I've got no doubt that it would be a pay-per-view fight in America and Canada, given Stevenson's name out there. Now, where I think this is an interesting fight, is I think Stevenson's main forte is his power. Carl Froch is convinced it's impossible for him to be knocked out, and you've got to say maybe he's right. Groves put him down. Groves is a big puncher, constantly hit him with that right hand, and despite the fact Groves, wobbled his legs a few times, Carl Froch didn't get stopped, and he kept getting stronger as the fight went on. So, you'd have to say that for a fighter who's all power, like Stevenson, it would perhaps play to, Froch is the kind of guy who can beat him, because Froch is the least likely to get knocked out. And I guess if Stevenson's having to cut a dramatic amount of weight to get down, that's only going to increase Froch's chances of, not getting knocked out. Now, where Stevenson's beatable, and I think the only time that Bellew looked good against him is in the third and the fourth, where Bellew started to press the axe. And there was it was only 20-30 second blast, but there was a time when Bellew bust Stevenson's nose, came forward on the front foot, backed him up, only for 15-20 seconds, but he looked effective at that point. And I think the way to beat Adonis Stevenson is to get inside. You've got to risk taking his right hand, which is where a fighter like Froch's chin would come into play, but you've got to put the pressure on him and not really do what Bellew did, which is fight 5 or 6 rounds, lose every round, but survive. You've got to kind of press the action against him, and I think Carl Froch's style is tailor-made to beat Stevenson, specifically if the fight's made at super middleweight and it takes Stevenson a lot of effort to cut down. I think Carl Froch, if he got inside and started landing his flurries on Stevenson, those trademark sort of Froch whirlwind style attacks, I think Stevenson could find himself in trouble. I think it's an interesting fight because, if Froch goes in and loses against Groves, his career's in real trouble. You'd have to say it would be time to call it a day. Whereas if he lost to Stevenson, there's still big fights out there. There's still the Groves rematch. There's still the Mikhail Kessler rubber match. There's a lot of fights out there for him. I think if he went in and lost to Groves now, there's limited options. I think the Mikhail Kessler rubber match is slightly less attractive at that stage. So I think Stevenson's a credible opponent. It seems that Froch is keen, or certainly hasn't been drawn into committing to fight Groves despite all the public pressure. So whether he's hiding from a rematch or not, I don't know. But it seems that he's certainly not going to be pressurised into one at this stage. And I think he's made it clear he wants to fight Andre Ward in the UK. I really don't see why that would happen. If I was Andre Ward, I probably wouldn't come over to the UK to fight. You're the undefeated fighter. You're the number one in the division. Why would you come to Carl Froch's backyard and risk a decision, especially with the fact that it's very unlikely that fight would, it's very likely that fight would go to the cards. The Mikhail Kessler fight, nobody knows if Kessler's retiring. I think there is public demand there, but I think that's a slightly easier win for Froch. So I don't think most would view Kessler as having too much of a chance of winning that fight. So that does leave the George Groves fight being the most viable option. I think the George Groves fight is certainly the one that's the most likely. If Froch does decide he wants to avoid George Groves, and I'm not going to use the word duck, but if he decides that he's had enough of George Groves for the time being and he wants to fight someone different, perhaps this new challenge from Stevenson is a possible one. Now, what's interesting is we haven't heard a Froch response yet to the news that Stevenson wants to challenge him. We haven't heard him, agree to it, laugh it off, be critical of Stevenson. There's been very little come back from Froch as of yet. He's probably just taken some time off. Maybe he's having a holiday after his fight. But it's an interesting proposition. As I say, it's pay-per-view both sides of the pond, which the George Groves fight isn't. And I do believe that Stevenson, Froch is the kind of guy who can go out and beat Stevenson. He's not afraid of going in against a power puncher, and he's got that come-forward style that is the way I believe you'd have to go out and beat Stevenson. So I just thought I'd do a little video on this one. I did some analysis on who I thought were viable options for Froch's next fight after the Groves fight, and I didn't really include Stevenson too much. So I didn't think that he'd be calling out Froch as aggressively as he was after that fight. I thought it was worth doing another video just to sort of update on that front. I think, just in final comment, the one thing I would say is there's a huge amount of interest in Adonis Stevenson fighting Sergey Kovalev, both huge punchers at light heavyweight, both being built aggressively by HBO. I think Adonis Stevenson may be slightly scared of Kovalev. I think he doesn't want any of Kovalev. The way Kovalev knocked out his opponent, Ismail Salak, was pretty devastating, pretty terrifying. and for someone like Stevenson, who's already been KO'd by a journeyman in Darnell Boone, it's very possible he wants none of that. That's possibly why he's putting all his eggs in the basket of calling out Carl Froch and Bernard Hopkins, because neither Hopkins, Froch's obviously a big puncher, Hopkins less so, but neither of those guys have the one-punch knockout explosive power that someone like Sergey Kovalev brings to the ring. And that's why I think this is a very makeable fight right now. Eddie Hearn, Froch's promoter, already has that relationship with Stevenson camp, following on from the Bellew fight. Adonis Stevenson, in my opinion, would do best to avoid Kovalev, so he needs to find someone else to fight in the interim. Froch possibly is doing his best to avoid Groves and needs to find someone out. And I just don't think Andre Ward's going to want to fight at this point. So I see this as being a realistic possibility. I think the public demand will still be for George Groves, but I think that if Froch has decided to avoid Groves, he's going to get less criticism if he goes in against Stevenson, because everyone knows Stevenson's a terrifying puncher. So it's one to monitor, possibly an interesting opponent, and we'll see how Froch gets on. Thanks for watching. Please leave your comments below. I know most people's opinions will be straight away that he's got to get back in with Groves. It's probably my opinion as well, to be honest. I'm just thinking if we start to think that Froch is definitely avoiding Groves, who would he go and fight next? And I think Stevenson's an interesting one. I'd probably have Froch as a slight favourite in that one, but obviously with Stevenson's power, he's always got a very big chance of winning a fight. But I'd probably have Froch as my favourite. He'd probably be my pick if they did fight, but it would be a very interesting fight to watch. Anyway, please leave your thoughts below on how viable it is Froch will fight Stevenson. I'd also be interested to hear who you'd be picking in that fight should it come into fruition. Thanks for watching, and it would be good to hear any feedback.